The first stab felt less like a cut and more like a punch. A sudden, deep internal impact that stole the air from Amelia Hayes's lungs and replaced it with a blinding, white-hot shock. Her mind, a finely tuned instrument of medical diagnosis and emergency procedure, scrambled for a foothold. Pneumothorax? Ruptured spleen? The thoughts were clinical, detached, a desperate attempt to categorize the chaos erupting within her own body. Then came the second, a vicious tear high on her shoulder, severing muscle and sending a bolt of pure, unadulterated pain down her arm. The world, which had been a cacophony of guttural shouts and the sickening thud of a body hitting metal, began to warp. Sounds became muffled, distant, as if she were sinking underwater. A third impact, this time in her side, a sickening wet intrusion. Two more followed in a brutal, blinding succession that she felt more than registered, each one a punctuation mark in a sentence of pure violence. She was on the asphalt. The rough, gritty texture of it pressed against her cheek, smelling of old oil and recent rain. Flashing lights began to pulse at the edge of her vision, a distant, strobing red and blue. Her training, the ingrained instinct of a decade in the ER, fought through the fog of shock. One thought, one single, overriding imperative surfaced through the agony. Is he okay? Just 90 seconds earlier, none of this had existed. The world had been simple, ordered, and blessedly mundane. 90 seconds earlier, the evening air in the strip mall parking lot was thick with the promise of a summer storm. The sky was a deep, bruised purple, and the neon sign of the Patriot Diner bled red and blue onto the wet pavement. Amelia Amy Hayes, 32 years old and bone-weary from a 12-hour shift that had included a 3-car pileup and a pediatric cardiac arrest, was finally walking to her sensible sedan. All she wanted was a hot shower and 8 hours of oblivion. That's when she saw him. An old man, his back ramrod straight despite the slight tremor in his hands, was fumbling with 2 paper grocery bags next to an old, beautifully maintained Ford pickup. He was the kind of man who seemed carved from a tougher era, his face a roadmap of long years and hard sun. As Amy watched, the bottom of one of the bags gave way. A can of chicken noodle soup, the irony was not lost on her, rolled across the asphalt and disappeared under a parked SUV. A sigh escaped the man's lips, a small sound of pure fatigue. For most people, it would have been a moment to look away, to get in their car and drive off into their own lives. But Amy was not most people. The Navy Nurse Corps sticker on her bumper wasn't just decoration. It was a tribute to her grandfather, a man who had taught her that service wasn't something you did, it was something you were. "Let me give you a hand with that," she called out, her voice carrying the easy, calm authority she used to soothe anxious patients. The old man looked up, startled. No, I've got it, ma'am." "It's no trouble." She was already there, crouching down to peer under the SUV. With a bit of maneuvering, she retrieved the runaway can. She saw the rest of his groceries scattered in the damp paper remains. "Here," she said, popping the trunk of her car. "I've got a couple of reusable bags in here. Let's get you squared away." He hesitated for a second, his pride warring with his pragmatism, but the pragmatism of age won out. Together, in the neon-flecked twilight, they transferred his groceries. He worked with a deliberate, slow precision. She noticed the faded, greenish ink of a tattoo on his forearm. A globe, an eagle, and an anchor. United States Marine Corps. "Take care of yourself, Sergeant," she said softly as they finished, the term of respect slipping out naturally. He paused, looking at her with a new sharpness in his faded blue eyes. He was surprised she'd known, not just the branch, but the implicit rank a man of his age and bearing would have carried. A flicker of a smile touched his lips. "Sergeant Major, back in the day," he corrected her gently. "Frank Kowalski. I appreciate the help, ma'am." "Amy Hayes." "And it was my pleasure, Sergeant Major." She gave him a genuine smile and turned to her car. It was a small, forgettable moment of human connection in a sprawling, anonymous city. A moment of kindness that should have been the end of the story. But as Frank opened the door to his immaculate old truck, 3 shadows detached themselves from the deeper darkness between the diner and the closed laundromat. They were young, radiating a jittery, aggressive energy. The one in the lead, all sharp angles and belligerent swagger, blocked Frank's door. "Evening, Grandpa," the leader, Rico Vargas, sneered. His two associates fanned out, their smirks ugly in the gloom. "How about you give us your wallet and the keys to this classic piece of junk?" Frank Kowalski, who had faced down enemy fire in the jungles of Vietnam and the deserts of Iraq, did not flinch. His posture, which had been stooped with age, straightened into the unbreakable frame of a United States Marine. "You picked the wrong man on the wrong day, son," he growled, his voice a low rumble of gravel and authority. Rico laughed, a short, ugly bark. He shoved Frank hard. The old Marine stumbled back, his shoulder hitting the truck with a dull thud. Amy was in her car, key in the ignition, when she saw the confrontation explode in her rearview mirror. A cold dread washed over her, instantly erasing her exhaustion. Her brain didn't deliberate. Her heart didn't weigh the options. She simply acted. She laid on the horn, a long, piercing blast, and leaned out the window. "Hey, leave him alone! I'm calling the police!" Her voice, sharp and clear, cut through the tension. It did exactly what she'd hoped. It drew their attention, and exactly what she feared. Rico's head snapped toward her, his eyes blazing with fury. His authority had been challenged. "You handle the old man," he spat at his friends, and then he stalked toward her car, his movements like those of a predator. Amy's mind raced. "He's coming for me. Lock the door." But her hand was a fraction of a second too slow. Rico yanked the door open with such force it shuddered on its hinges. She recoiled, but instinct took over again. She got out of the car, putting herself between him and the vehicle, trying to create space. "There's no need for this," she said, her voice steady, falling back on the de-escalation techniques she'd used on 1,000 agitated patients and distraught family members. "Just walk away. Right now, no one has to get hurt." Behind her, a pained cry from Frank told her she had failed. One of the others had punched him, and she heard the sickening crunch of his body slumping against the truck's side panel. That sound broke something inside her. The cool professionalism vanished, replaced by a surge of protective fire. She wasn't a nurse anymore, she was a shield. She abandoned her attempt to reason with Rico and rushed toward Frank, her only thought to get her body between him and his attackers. It was a fatal miscalculation. Rico, incensed by her defiance, was on her in a flash. He grabbed her by the arm, his grip like iron, and spun her around. The world became a kaleidoscope of motion and malice. He was shouting something, his face a mask of rage. She saw the glint of metal in his hand. It wasn't a gun, it was a knife, its blade catching the lurid glow of the diner's sign. And then came the punch of white-hot shock, and the world began to die. Lying on the asphalt, the life bleeding out of her, her last conscious act was to reach a trembling, blood-slicked hand toward the unmoving form of Sergeant Major Frank Kowalski. The sirens were screaming now, getting closer, but all she could manage was a whisper, a final question to the uncaring night. "Is he okay?" To understand why Amelia Hayes ran toward danger instead of away from it, you had to understand the quiet moments that had forged her. You had to go back to a sun-drenched room in a small house smelling of mothballs and old paper. There, a 12-year-old Amy would sit for hours at the bedside of her grandfather, a man whose body had been failed by time but whose spirit still sailed the Pacific. He was a Navy corpsman from the Second World War, and he'd tell her stories, not of glory or combat, but of holding hands, of patching wounds, of being the last friendly face a scared kid from Ohio ever saw. "We weren't heroes, Amy girl," he'd rasped, his hand cool and papery in hers. "We were just the guys who were there. You just have to be there." That lesson became her compass. It guided her through the grueling, sleep-deprived years of nursing school. It was there in the sterile anatomy labs and the chaotic clinical rotations. It manifested in 1,000 small acts of compassion, comforting a terrified child waiting for stitches, meticulously cleaning the wounds of an unconscious homeless man brought into the ER, sharing a box of donuts with the night shift orderlies because she knew no one ever thanked them. The day she received her nursing pin, she didn't feel triumph, so much as a profound sense of responsibility. She was one of the guys who was there. Her career was a testament to that ethos. She chose the chaotic, high-stakes world of the ER and ICU, floating between the two as needed. She had a reputation for being unflappable. When a multi-car pileup flooded the trauma bays, Amy moved through the chaos like a calming current, her voice clear, her hands steady. She could deliver a devastating diagnosis to a family with a gentle gravity that honored their pain. And 5 minutes later, be sharing a quiet joke with a patient who had finally turned a corner. She wasn't an adrenaline junkie. She was a caretaker in the purest sense. She ran toward the fire not because she was fearless, but because that's where the people who needed help were. And on a rainy Tuesday night, the fire was in a parking lot, engulfing a proud old Marine. She did the only thing she knew how to do. She went to be there. The first thing Amy was aware of was the rhythmic, metronomic beep of a heart monitor. It was a sound so familiar it was almost comforting. The second was a deep, searing pain that seemed to originate from the very core of her being and radiate outward. She opened her eyes to the sterile white tiles of a hospital ceiling. "Welcome back, Amy." She turned her head. Dr. Lena Chen stood by her bedside, her face etched with a mixture of professional calm and genuine concern. Amy knew her from the hospital. They'd shared countless shifts, a silent partnership of saving lives. "Lena?" Amy's voice was a dry, cracking whisper. "You're in the ICU," Dr. Chen said softly. "You've been out for about 12 hours. You had us pretty worried." She went on to explain the injuries with clinical precision. 5 stab wounds. 1 to the upper arm, 1 to the shoulder, 2 to the abdomen that had nicked her bowel, and a 5th, the most serious, that had punctured her diaphragm and collapsed her left lung. Emergency surgery had saved her life. "You've got a long road ahead of you," she concluded, "but you're going to be okay." The medical facts washed over Amy, but her mind was fixed on one thing. "The man," she rasped, the effort sending a jolt of pain through her chest. From the parking lot, "Sergeant Kowalski, is he alive?" A small, sad smile touched Dr. Chen's lips. "He's alive. He's a few doors down, actually. Severe concussion, a broken wrist, and some nasty bruises, but he's stable. The paramedics said the attackers were focused on you. You saved his life, Amy. You kept them off him long enough for help to arrive." Relief, so potent it felt like a drug, flooded Amy's system, momentarily eclipsing the pain. He was okay. It had been worth it. She closed her eyes, adrift on a sea of morphine and exhaustion. Her peace was short-lived. The next day brought her first official visitor, Detective Carl Miller. He was a man in his 50s who looked like he'd been sleeping in his wrinkled suit. He carried a styrofoam cup of coffee that looked as tired as he did, and he oozed an aura of profound, soul-deep apathy. He pulled a chair to her bedside without asking. "All right, Miss Hayes, let's go over this," he began, his voice a flat monotone. He flipped open a small, dog-eared notepad. "So, you saw an altercation in progress and you decided to get involved?" The phrasing, "decided to get involved," was a tiny pebble of wrongness in Amy's mind. It wasn't a decision. It was a reaction. "They were hurting an elderly man," she said, her voice still weak. 3 of them. I had to do something." Miller took a loud sip of his coffee. "You didn't think to just call 911 and stay in your car? Wait for us to handle it?" The question wasn't accusatory, not quite. It was worse. It was dismissive, tinged with the weary condescension of a man who had seen too many well-intentioned civilians make his job more complicated. "There wasn't time," Amy insisted, a spark of frustration cutting through her pain. "They had him on the ground. They were going to kill him." "Right." Miller sighed back, scribbling a note that seemed performatively slow. "And the attackers. You get a good look at them? Tattoos, scars, anything like that? What were they wearing?" Amy did her best to describe them, but the memory was a chaotic blur of rage-contorted faces and dark clothing. Miller's pen scratched against the paper. He asked the questions by rote, his eyes scanning the room, landing on the IV drip, the window, anywhere but on the woman, who had 5 fresh holes in her body. He offered no words of comfort, no praise for her courage, no sympathy for her suffering. To Detective Miller, she was not a hero or a victim. She was a file, a complication in a long, thankless day. Okay, he said finally, snapping his notepad shut. He stood, his knees cracking. We'll look into it. A lot of scumbags out there. Try to get some rest. And with that, the first representative of the law walked out, leaving Amy feeling profoundly, chillingly alone. The physical pain was immense, but this new ache, the sting of indifference, was sharper. The next visitor arrived a day later, and he was the opposite of Miller in every way except the most important one. Mr. Gerald Caldwell was the hospital's chief administrator, a man who glided rather than walked, encased in a tailored suit that probably cost more than Amy's car. He brought a large, ostentatious bouquet of lilies and a smile that was perfectly white, perfectly even, and completely devoid of warmth. "Amelia," he began, his voice a silky, practiced baritone. "A terrible, terrible ordeal. On behalf of the entire Northwood General family, we are so sorry this happened to you." "Thank you, Mr. Caldwell," Amy murmured. "We want to make sure you're taken care of," he continued, placing the flowers on her bedside table where they immediately made the room smell like a funeral parlor. "We're placing you on indefinite paid medical leave, of course. Full salary. We take care of our own." He paused, his polished demeanor shifting subtly. "Now, our legal team has been looking at this, a very unfortunate and highly unusual situation. It's imperative, for everyone's sake, that the hospital maintains its reputation as a safe place for our staff and our patients." He slid a sleek, leather-bound folder onto her blanket. It made a soft thud next to her wounded abdomen. "This is just a standard form, Amelia. It outlines the comprehensive support package we're offering you. It's quite generous. It also contains a small, standard confidentiality clause. I'm sure you understand, we find it's always best to let the police handle all public communication in these matters. We wouldn't want the media to get hold of this and misrepresent the situation. It would only cause undue stress for you during your recovery, and of course, could be damaging to the hospital's good name." Amy stared at the folder. She didn't need to open it to understand what it was. It was hush money. It was a gag order wrapped in the language of corporate concern. He wasn't protecting her. He was protecting the institution from a potential lawsuit, from bad PR, from the ugly truth that one of their nurses had been nearly eviscerated in a parking lot they were supposed to keep secure. His concern was a calculated insult. She felt a cold anger rise within her, a feeling so potent it almost made her forget the pain. This man, in his $1,000 suit, was trying to buy her silence, to package her trauma into a neat, tidy, and confidential settlement. He was a vulture in pinstripes. Weeks crawled by. Amy was discharged into the lonely quiet of her small apartment, her days a monotonous cycle of pain medication, fitful sleep, and excruciating physical therapy. Every breath was a reminder. Every time she tried to lift her arm, a jolt of fire told her what she had lost. The silence from the outside world was a different kind of pain. She called Detective Miller's desk for an update. He didn't answer. She left a message. He didn't call back. A week later, she tried again and caught him. "Ms. Hayes," he said, his voice thick with annoyance, "I told you we're working on it. We're chasing down some leads. These things take time. You'll be the first to know if we get a break." He sounded like he was reading from a script. She knew what it meant. Her case was at the bottom of a very tall pile. Meanwhile, she imagined Rico Vargas and his friends walking free, laughing, their crime already a distant memory for them, while it was an ever-present reality for her. The news cycle had moved on. She was old news, a forgotten hero. Then, a sudden, unexpected break. An anonymous tip, a jilted girlfriend of one of Rico's associates, led to their arrest. A surge of fierce, triumphant relief washed over Amy. Finally, justice. She was summoned to the district attorney's office, her hope rekindled. She was shown into the office of Assistant District Attorney Mark Thompson. He was a man in his 40s, with a sharp suit, a sharper haircut, and the restless, ambitious eyes of a man already planning his next career move. He offered her a seat with a practiced politician's smile. "Ms. Hayes, thank you for coming in," he began. "I'm ADA Thompson. I'll be handling the prosecution of the men who attacked you and Mr. Kowalski." "I'm just glad they've been caught," Amy said, her voice filled with earnest relief. "I'll do whatever it takes. I'll testify. I'll do anything to make sure they're convicted." Thompson leaned back in his leather chair, steepling his fingers. His smile faded into an expression of thoughtful pragmatism. "About that," he said, his tone shifting. "The case isn't what you'd call a slam dunk. The defendants predictably are claiming you were the aggressor, that you escalated a simple argument. It's absolute nonsense, of course, but a jury can be unpredictable. And these men, they have no prior felony convictions. They'll look like kids who made a stupid mistake to a sympathetic juror." Amy felt a cold knot form in her stomach. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying a trial is a risk," Thompson said smoothly. "And I don't like risks. I like convictions. So, my office is prepared to offer them a deal. They plead guilty to one count of aggravated assault each. We drop the attempted murder, conspiracy, and armed robbery charges. They'll do a few years, probably be out in 18 months with good behavior. It's a guaranteed win for us. We put them away, we clear the case, and you avoid the emotional trauma of a public trial and a cross-examination." The room seemed to tilt. 18 months, for 5 stab wounds, for leaving an old man bleeding on the ground, for shattering her life. The words came out of her mouth before she could stop them, low and trembling with fury. 18 months? That's not justice. That's a clerical transaction. That's a rounding error. Thompson's expression tightened. The mask of empathy fell away, revealing the cold calculus of a bureaucrat. "It's a practical solution, Ms. Hayes," he said, his voice laced with condescension. "It's the smart play. I'm trying to get you a result. Your emotional response, while understandable, isn't helpful to the legal process." That was it. That was the final blow. The attack in the parking lot had been brutal, but it was the work of vicious, stupid men. This was different. This was the system itself, the police, the hospital, the prosecutor, all telling her in their own way that her courage was an inconvenience, her suffering was a liability, and her demand for justice was impractical. They were the walls of a prison of indifference, and she was trapped inside. Something inside Amelia Hayes snapped. It wasn't loud or violent. It was a quiet, cold, and absolute shift. She looked at Ada Mark Thompson, at his smug, pragmatic face, and she saw the embodiment of every dismissal, every condescending remark, every bureaucratic shortcut she had endured for the past month. She stood up. Her knees were weak, but her spine felt like steel. Her hands, resting on the table, were shaking, but her voice when she spoke was perfectly, terrifyingly calm. "No." Thompson blinked. "I'm sorry?" "No," she repeated, her gaze locked on his. "I will not agree to that. You will not offer that deal. You will take them to trial on every single charge. Attempted murder, armed robbery, everything. And if you are not willing to do that, then you will find me a prosecutor who is. They nearly killed 2 people. They will not get away with a slap on the wrist because it's the smart play for your conviction rate." She turned and walked out of his office, leaving a stunned silence in her wake. In the marble-floored hallway, she leaned against the cool wall, the adrenaline fading, leaving her feeling hollowed out and terrified. She had just declared war on the district attorney's office. She was one woman against a machine, but for the first time since she'd woken up in the ICU, she felt like she was breathing her own air. That evening, feeling more alone than ever, she thought of the one person in the whole ordeal who had shown her uncomplicated kindness. She found Dr. Lena Chen's number in the hospital directory and called. "Amy, are you okay?" Lena's voice was instantly warm with concern. Amy's composure crumbled. The whole story came tumbling out. The dismissive detective, the hospital's gag order, and finally, the DA's insulting plea bargain. She wasn't asking for help. She was just venting to the only friendly ear she could think of. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. When Dr. Chen finally spoke, her voice was cold with anger. "That's not just wrong, Amy. It's obscene. They are burying you and that poor man in paperwork to protect themselves. People need to know about this." "But who would listen?" Amy asked, her voice thick with despair. "I might know someone," Dr. Chen said, a new energy in her tone. "My cousin, Maria Sanchez. She's a reporter for Channel 8 News. She's young, she's hungry, and she hates bullies. Would you be willing would you be willing to talk to her? A week ago, Amy would have said no. She would have honored Mr. Caldwell's veiled threats and retreated into her private pain. But the woman who had walked out of the DA's office was different. Yes, Amy said, her voice firm. Yes, I will. The meeting with Maria Sanchez took place in a quiet corner of a coffee shop. Maria was in her late 20s, with bright, intelligent eyes that missed nothing. She didn't just listen to Amy's story, she absorbed it. She asked sharp, insightful questions. She saw the connections Amy had only felt, the thread of systemic indifference that ran from the police department to the hospital boardroom to the prosecutor's office. When Amy finished, Maria closed her notebook. "This is more than a crime story," she said, her expression grimly determined. "This is a story about what happens after the sirens fade. Thank you for trusting me with it, Amy. I won't let you down." The story aired 3 days later on the 6 o'clock news. It was a masterful piece of local journalism. Maria Sanchez didn't editorialize. She simply laid out the facts, creating a devastating narrative. It opened with a shot of Amy, her face pale but resolute, recounting the attack. Then a file photo of a young, proud Frank Kowalski in his Marine Corps dress blues, followed by a shot of the strip mall parking lot. Maria's voiceover was crisp and clear. A hero nurse stabbed 5 times. A decorated veteran left for dead, but their ordeal, it turns out, was just beginning. The segment detailed her fight, the stalled police investigation, the hospital's confidentiality agreement, the DA's proposed plea bargain. It ended with on-screen text. The district attorney's office, the Northwood Police Department, and Northwood General Hospital all declined to comment for this story. Their silence was more damning than any confession. The story was a ripple in the vast pond of the nightly news. But ripples travel. Hundreds of miles away, on the sprawling base of Camp Lejeune, North Carolina, Gunnery Sergeant David Kowalski was scrolling through his phone on his bunk, trying to decompress after a grueling day on the rifle range. A link popped up in a message from his aunt. The subject line read, "You need to see this about your dad." He clicked it. He watched the 2-minute news report. His face, normally a disciplined mask, hardened through stages of confusion, disbelief, and finally, a cold, diamond-hard fury. He saw the picture of his father, the man who had taught him what it meant to be a Marine, described as an elderly victim. He heard Amy's quiet, dignified voice describing how she had been stabbed and how the system was now failing them both. The Marine Corps ethos is built on a simple, sacred principle. Semper Fidelis, always faithful. Faithful to the Corps, to your country, to the Marine on your left and right. And by extension, faithful to those who stand with you. Amelia Hayes had stood with a Marine. She had bled for him. And now she was standing alone against a tide of bureaucratic cowardice. David Kowalski was a gunnery sergeant. He wasn't a man given to wild, emotional outbursts. He was a leader, a planner. He thought for a moment, his rage cooling into a focused, strategic objective. He opened his laptop. He logged onto a private Facebook group for Marines in his battalion, and then onto a larger, well-known online forum for veterans and active duty personnel. He posted the link to the news story. His caption was not a call for violence or a rant. It was simple, direct, and powerful. It was a call to honor. "This is my father, retired Sergeant Maj Frank Kowalski. Last month he was attacked. This nurse, Amelia Hayes, saved his life and took 5 knife wounds for him. Now, the system that's supposed to protect us is trying to let the animals who did this walk away with a slap on the wrist." She stood up for a Marine when he couldn't stand himself. We don't let our allies fight alone. Semper Fi. He hit post. The spark had been lit. The digital fuse was burning. The morning broke gray and humid. Amy woke up at 7, the familiar ache in her side, a dull throb that promised to sharpen as the day wore on. The news story had unleashed a small storm. Her phone had buzzed with supportive messages from friends and former colleagues, but it had also brought a venomous call from an apoplectic ADA Thompson, who had accused her of trying to poison a potential jury pool and warned her of legal consequences. She felt exhausted, exposed, and more isolated than ever. She limped to the kitchen, made a cup of coffee, and stared out the window at her quiet suburban street, wondering if she had just made everything worse. That's when she saw the car, a plain, dark sedan she didn't recognize parked across the street. A man got out. He was tall, lean, with the unmistakable high and tight haircut of a career military man. He was wearing the Marine Corps Service Alpha uniform, green coat, khaki shirt and tie, medals gleaming on his chest. He didn't approach her house. He didn't look at his phone. He simply walked to the public sidewalk in front of her lawn, faced her front door, and stood perfectly still, his hands clasped behind his back in a formal parade rest. Amy stared, her coffee cup frozen halfway to her lips. Who was he? What did he want? A flicker of fear went through her. Was this some kind of intimidation tactic from the DA? Then another car pulled up behind the first. Two more men got out, younger, both in the same immaculate uniform. They nodded once, a curt, almost imperceptible gesture to the first man, and took up positions on either side of him. They too fell into a silent, motionless parade rest. A beat-up pickup truck rattled to a stop down the block. An older man, his face a leathery testament to a long life, got out. He wore a simple red cap with USMC veteran embroidered on it. He walked with a slight limp, but his back was straight as he joined the end of the line. And then they just kept coming. Within 20 minutes, Sycamore Street was transformed. Cars lined both curbs. The sidewalk in front of Amy's small, tidy house was becoming a sea of men and women. Young Marines with the fresh-faced seriousness of recruits just out of Paris Island stood shoulder to shoulder with grizzled veterans in their 70s, their service denoted by caps from Vietnam, Beirut, Desert Storm, Iraq, Afghanistan. Some were in full dress uniform. Others were in civilian clothes, distinguished only by a USMC sweatshirt or a small pinned eagle, globe, and anchor. They were black, white, Hispanic, Asian. They were men and women. They formed a silent protective cordon, a living wall of honor. They weren't protesting, they weren't holding signs or chanting slogans, they were simply standing watch. Neighbors peeked out from behind their curtains, their faces a mixture of confusion and awe. The silence was the most powerful part. It was a profound, respectful silence that absorbed the morning sounds of birds and distant traffic, creating a bubble of solemn purpose around Amy's home. The crowd swelled from a dozen to 50, then past 70, then to well over 100. Trembling, Amy pulled on a robe and opened her front door. She stepped onto her small porch, and the sheer visual impact of it stole her breath. 100 pairs of eyes, all fixed on her house, all radiating a quiet, unshakable resolve. The first man, the tall gunnery sergeant, detached himself from the center of the line. He walked up her driveway with a measured, deliberate pace. He stopped at the bottom of her porch steps, his shoes gleaming even in the dull morning light. He looked up at her, his expression one of deep respect, and rendered a slow, perfect salute. "Ma'am," he said, his voice clear and steady, "Gunnery Sergeant David Kowalski. Frank Kowalski is my father." Amy's hand went to her mouth, a sob catching in her throat. I don't understand." "You stood your ground for a Marine," David said, his eyes locking with hers. "You took a blade for him. The Marine Corps doesn't forget that. We're taught from day one that we don't leave our wounded on the battlefield, and we don't leave our allies to fight alone." He took a small step closer. "You had our 6, ma'am. Now we have yours. No one is going to intimidate you. No one is going to make you feel alone again. We'll be here as long as it takes." The dam broke. The weeks of pain, fear, and soul-crushing indifference washed away in a flood of tears. But these were not tears of sadness. They were tears of profound, overwhelming relief. She wasn't alone. Oh God, she wasn't alone. The silent wall of Marines stood witness to her release, their stoic presence a promise, an anchor in the storm that her life had become. The whirring blades of a helicopter broke the spell. It was a news chopper. Then, a Channel 8 van screeched to a halt at the end of the street, Maria Sanchez practically jumping out before it had fully stopped. The local story had just gone irrevocably, explosively national. The silent vigil on Sycamore Street was about to become a roar heard across the country. The consequences were immediate and seismic. The image of over 100 uniformed Marines standing silent guard, outside a suburban nurse's home was pure political dynamite. A montage of the fallout played across national news networks. In the district attorney's office, the phones rang with a shrieking, incessant fury. An aide was shown nervously walking into the office of the district attorney herself, a stern, politically ambitious woman who was watching the live feed from Sycamore Street on a large monitor, her face a mask of cold fury. She was seen storming into ADA Mark Thompson's office and slamming the door, the muffled sounds of a one-sided shouting match audible even through the thick wood. At a hastily called press conference, the Northwood chief of police, a man who normally projected an image of gruff control, was visibly sweating under the television lights. He praised Ms. Amelia Hayes's extraordinary and selfless heroism and announced that he had personally reassigned Detective Miller to traffic duty and put his top 2 homicide investigators on the case, promising a thorough, vigorous, and transparent prosecution to the fullest extent of the law. At Northwood General, the board of directors had apparently held an emergency meeting. A pale and humiliated Mr. Gerald Caldwell stood before a bank of microphones, reading a stilted statement about the hospital's deep pride in our heroic nurse, Amelia Hayes. He announced, to the surprise of everyone, that the hospital was immediately donating $50,000 to the Wounded Warrior Project in her name. The pressure was absolute. The system, which had been a cold, unmoving wall of indifference, cracked and crumbled under the weight of national scrutiny. The quiet backroom deal ADA Thompson had tried to broker was now a political impossibility. The DA's office, in a stunning reversal, announced they were pursuing all original charges against Rico Vargas and his associates, including attempted murder. Faced with a media firestorm, a mountain of evidence, and a prosecution team that was now fighting for its public reputation, the defendant's bravado evaporated. The trial was swift. The jury, fully aware of the context surrounding the case, deliberated for less than 2 hours. Rico Vargas was found guilty on all counts and sentenced to 25 years to life. His associates received hefty sentences of their own. The camera caught a final shot of them being led from the courtroom, their sneers replaced by the slack-jawed shock of thugs who had finally, belatedly, faced real consequences. A few weeks later, Amy, accompanied by David Kowalski, walked into a room at a physical rehabilitation center. Sergeant Major Frank Kowalski was sitting in a chair by the window, watching a replay of the news story about the vigil. There were tears tracing paths down his weathered cheeks. He saw Amy and struggled to his feet, waving off his son's attempt to help him. He stood tall, the old Marine frame reasserting itself. "They told me what you did," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he rarely showed. "In the Corps. They give out a Navy Cross for that kind of bravery in the face of the enemy." He reached out and took her hand, his grip surprisingly strong. "Thank you isn't a big enough word for what you did, for what you went through." "I'd do it again, Sergeant Major," Amy said softly, and she meant it. He simply nodded, his eyes shining. In that quiet room, away from the cameras and the crowds, the debt was finally, properly acknowledged, and a bond forged in violence was healed with gratitude. 1 year later, the ballroom of a downtown hotel was filled with the warm chatter of a sold-out crowd. Polished silverware gleamed under crystal chandeliers. At the front of the room, a large banner read, "The Sentinel Foundation First Annual Gala." The foundation, founded by Amelia Hayes and the Kowalski family, had become a national phenomenon. Its mission was simple and born from Amy's ordeal: to provide immediate financial and legal support to civilians who were injured or faced hardship as a direct result of helping military veterans in crisis. Amelia Hayes stood at the podium. She was no longer the pale, haunted woman from the news reports. Her scars were still there, hidden beneath a simple, elegant blue dress, but she wore them with a new kind of strength. Her eyes were bright, her voice clear and confident as she addressed the room. "A single act of courage can feel like a small thing," she said, her gaze sweeping across the faces in the crowd. "It can feel like a whisper in a storm, easily lost, easily ignored. For a while, that's what I thought mine was. But I learned something on a gray morning on Sycamore Street. I learned that when that courage is met with honor, that whisper becomes a roar that can tear down walls of indifference and remind us of the simple, powerful truth that we are all in this together." Her eyes found her front table. There sat a fully recovered Frank Kowalski, looking 10 years younger, his arm around his son, David. Scattered throughout the crowd, some in suits, some in their old uniforms, were the faces of the Marines who had stood watch for her. They were her honor guard. They were her family. The camera of a documentary crew filming the event pushed in on Amy's face. She finished her speech to a thunderous, standing ovation. She looked out at the sea of support, at the legacy born from her darkest moment, and a genuine, radiant smile lit up her face. She was no longer a victim, no longer just a hero. She was a sentinel, and her watch had just begun.